fellow soul searchers. This is Gleecon, and welcome to A Gleeman's Guide to the Bible. We will begin this, our first episode, with the mother of all beginnings, the first chapter of Genesis. A book and a chapter that is a synonym for the word beginning itself. The framework of this podcast will be as follows: a preamble of each chapter that discusses authorship, context, or throws a little light on what we're about to read. Then we'll read the episode's chapter together, trying to reserve comment for the end unless I absolutely cannot help myself. Then we will recap what we read by discussing how religious and political conservatives engage with the chapter, how the irreligious and liberals do the same, and how these approaches, when left unchecked, have led to some of the craziest ideas and interesting stories Earth has to offer. At the end of each episode, I will tie it all together with my honest attempt to make sense and live within it all. So, let's start with that. How do we make sense of the Bible? This is an incredibly difficult task when you consider that most of us have only read a translation of probably another translation or a compilation of translations of some type of oral history reduced to writing. Think of it as a species-wide game of telephone spanning thousands of years that people die for, or at least stop their Thanksgiving invitations over. And this is all before debates regarding whether certain translations are actually the only correct translations. I'm looking at you, Catholic Church, and their Latin Vulgate, or the countless congregations that still operate today only trusting the endorsement of King James. And by the way, this podcast is going to use something known as the Berean Bible because it's a public domain Bible and it's generally well regarded. But if we all decide that you prefer the King's English, let me know. If there's enough of a clamor, I'll switch to that. The King James Version is public domain too, which shows my hand a little, and that I personally don't slavishly devote myself to any particular version of the Bible. Anyway, once we start thinking about translations, the age of the text, the mind can easily stumble into one of the most researched questions in all of history. And it's the one we will preamble today's episode with. Just who did write Genesis and the specific account of the creation of existence anyway? So the identity of the author of Genesis is such a hotbed of debate, mostly because nobody ever claimed ownership in the original scrolls themselves. The practice of signing your name as an author didn't start being a mainstream thing until Greek philosophers like Homer started mic-dropping their works with their own names. Unfortunately for our peace of mind, this practice was a few hundred years too late to answer our question. That meant that in the 3,000 years of Judaism and Christianity that have followed, we've had to scramble for evidence. And there are basically two schools of thought, setting aside the purely irreligious idea of, who cares? It's just a bunch of borrowed fables and co-opted legends from other early civilizations. It's all myth anyway. Or an just as eyes slam shut approach of, God inspired it, period. Nothing else really matters. The two schools of thought serve as a good barometer for the entire approach to the Christian religion. That's going to define the lenses that we view the Bible in this podcast, and we're going to be highlighting on these kind of two sides of the spectrum again and again throughout. Now, one major faction looks at the Bible itself and comes down with Moses as the author. There are numerous references throughout the Bible to the law of Moses. Jesus himself cites Moses, implying that he is an author. And there's a lot of ancient Jewish writing tradition that centers around great autobiographical sagas and heroes writing and being at the center of their own tales. Now, there are some sticky problems that this theory struggles to answer. Like, okay, if Moses wrote it, how is he giving firsthand descriptions of the creation of an earth that clearly must have happened before he got there? Or at the end of Deuteronomy, how is he writing about his own death and what happened right after that? Now, as far as the description of the beginning goes, there are no great answers, basically just concessions to the idea like, okay, some of these writings were obviously recounting ancient Jewish oral traditions, or these visions of the creation of the universe were hand delivered to Moses by God, which is always the answer if you're going by strict biblical inerrancy. And you can't make an argument against that, so I'm not going to ever spend too much time on it. Suffice it to say that, sure, against every article, against every argument, we could always choose to answer it with, it was delivered in its pure form, exactly how God wanted it to be delivered, and it has been translated, every single word, exactly according to the way that God wanted it, and should always be taken verbatim. Okay, end of podcast. We don't have to say anything else. The death of Moses in this approach does also have some banger theories, but we're going to save those for when we actually start talking about the death of Moses in those chapters. But there's some creative ways of dealing with that too. Another faction instead goes straight to archaeology, historical beliefs, documents of nearby civilizations, textual and literary analyses that come up with what's known as something called the documentary hypothesis. Now, this says that there are multiple versions of Genesis floating around, that there was a group in the nation of Judah. Israel is split into two halves in the old days, and Judah was the southern kingdom, and they originally reduced these to writing. This is known as the J document because original translators called Yahweh, Jehovah, which starts with a J. It's not because of the tribe Judah. And they start passing those around. And about 100 years or so later, the northern half of Israel gets in on this game too and do their own version. This is called the E document, which is for Elohim, another way of referring to God. Another version of Deuteronomy starts floating around a couple hundred years later in Jerusalem. And that also helps these documentary theorists square some difficulties in the latter parts of Deuteronomy. And that's known as the D document for the Deuteronomy document. And finally, a priest caste of Jews, either towards the end of and during the exile into Egypt and immediately in being fresh back from Egypt within a couple hundred years, they make this big scholarly retcon of all of it that focuses on nitty-gritty details, priestly rites, lineages, rules. That's called the P document. And finally, the Jewish religious leaders compile all of these different versions together in this major editorial effort to create what we now call the Torah, and that's in the 400s BC, over half a millennium after the events originally took place, the story of Moses. Now, as I said in my last episode, this complicated theory, it's actually pretty compelling. It seems realistic. It explains a lot of the seeming inconsistencies and redundancies as they are weaving the texts together. And it carries absolutely no definitive or divine authority whatsoever, and thus to this day the debate lives on. We will expand on this debate throughout the Pentateuch and discuss what that even means, the Pentateuch, when we refer to it in later episodes, as well as place these writings in their historical and geographical settings over the next few chapters. But for now, as much of an intro that we will need to begin our communal reading of the Bible with Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate the waters from the waters." So God made the expanse and separated the waters beneath it from the waters above, and it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered into one place, so that dry land may appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation, seed-bearing plants and fruit trees, each bearing fruit with seed according to its kind." And it was so. The earth produced vegetation, seed-bearing plants according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seeds according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to distinguish between the day and the night, and let them be signs to mark the seasons and days and years, and let them serve as lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and he made the stars as well. God set these lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth, to preside over the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the sky." So God created the great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters teemed according to their kinds, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters of the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, land crawlers, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that crawls upon the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, to rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, and over all the earth itself, and every creature that crawls upon it." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every creature that crawls upon the earth." Then God said, "Behold, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit contains seed. They will be yours for food. And to every beast of the earth, and every bird of the air, and every creature that crawls upon the earth, everything that has the breath of life in it, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God looked upon all that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. What we just read was a tale of creation, one that is marked by many noteworthy events, some debatable, others less so. The important things to note going forward are that we have God on the scene, and we have a universe that now exists with a sun, moon, stars, our very own earth, equipped with waters above and below, a sky, land masses, plants and animals filling the oceans, skies, and lands. And finally, we have the creation of humans in God's image, with dominion over all life on earth, both male and female. We also immediately have grounds for religious schism. There's a debate over the word God, whether it reflects a pluralism common to the region and era, whether the different words for God edify the documentary theory. There's also debate whether this story is derivative of the Babylonian, Sumerian, etc. mythologies of the day. In almost every single line, seeds are planted for future theories, future philosophies, and definitely future dissensions. We're going to hold off and address those controversies in the next few episodes in order to focus on just one specific issue in this episode. But for now, let's just note that God is a translation of Elohim in this chapter, which in the original Hebrew is a plural word that meant gods. This in itself has fueled a reduction of the Bible on the one side to just another polytheistic primitive myth. On another, it's completely ignored or dismissed away as, oh, it's the royal we. Or it is explained as a concession being made by the writer or writers, Moses or the priest caste, as a word that, is technically plural, but it was actually always used at the time of the writing in the singular form, kind of like sheep. It's also frequently cited as a foreshadowing of the triune God of Christianity. But for now, we'll focus on the central debate that this chapter sparks. The good old debate over creationism. Now, the chapter we just read is the foundation of the Bible, which means its verbatim truth, also known as inerrancy, is extremely important for a large number of Christians who ascribe to the belief that every word in the Bible is the rigid black and white message of God. Any thoughts, any scientific theories or philosophies that challenge the literal occurrence of the events in this chapter have thus been fiercely combated, if not sent people to literally be burned at the stake. When you have the entire moral and existential foundation you have built your life, your self-worth, and more importantly, the power hierarchies surrounding you on, it is not at all surprising that you get some of these reactions. With time, however, murdering people as heretics because they don't believe the same thing as you do became slightly frowned upon. Now, this was great for people who thought a 7-day creation of the universe, for starters, seemed a stretch, but it also forced proponents of inerrancy to adapt, and notably to open the door a crack to the idea that just maybe some things in the Bible were subject to a certain degree of interpretation. As it stands today, you have the inerrant side splitting into the young earth creationists who believe that straight up the world is 6,000 years old, more or less. It was literally Thanos snapped into existence in 7 days. You have old earth creationists who believe a variety of things. Some say the earth was a 6-day job, but the rest day or the gap was either a really long time or it's still ongoing now. You have the observance that the word day used in Genesis is not a 24-hour day in Hebrew, but indicates a word that can be taken poetically, like in the day of the steam engine. It doesn't conflict with mainstream secular science at all. Or, this is one of my personal favorites due to its sheer creativity, the days are citing the school days of Moses on the mountaintop with God, like God's lesson plan. Day 1, we teach Moses about how I made light. And like pretty much every student I've ever taught, he walked away with 1 sentence of notes from that day. Sounds about right. This is also where geocentric versus heliocentric debates came from, a debate which actually still whispers around today in the form of flat earthers and staged moon landing conspiracies. But in the end, most people agree this is a point for team science and a massive own goal for the ancient church, as it's never actually said or implied anywhere in the Bible that the earth is the center of the universe. Famously, this is also where a subset of our creationism debate comes from, the debate over evolution. And that fight is still pretty active today. So we just read God filled the skies and waters with animals on day 5, and then the next day he populated the land. capping off his creative efforts with the pinnacle of creation, us. Creationists believe this is literally true. Whales and pterodactyls on Friday, triceratops and dudes and dudettes on Saturday, all together, all chilling, and fossils as evidence or lack are just crap. Unless the fossils are showing a lack of missing links, and then we need to cite that and point that out. People who are mainlining pure Charles Darwin, who in turn ripped his theory directly from his atheist grandfather, take it on faith that there is a direct line from single-celled ocean creatures to me and my smartphone. In the meantime, both sides of the argument are jiggly at best. There's obviously room for some sort of gradual species modification, whether you want to call it evolution or not. We purposely do it in plants, dogs, livestock. We cause animals to go extinct. There is something called ring species. Even biblically, we're given dominion over all creatures, which has led to extinctions, selective breeding, the unnatural thriving of certain species over others. On the other side, though, there's a reason why evolution is still a highly contested theory. It currently requires many leaps of faith that lack examples or proof. Selective breeding often leads to sterility. Mutations are almost always adverse rather than giving the mutant a sudden leg up unless you are an X-Man. And most perplexing of all is humanity with its language, communities, and culture. The attempts to explain that those aspects of humanity are still widely debated among scholars today. And the best we can say is, we don't know how they evolved. We hope we don't know how they evolved yet. But these are all just some of the, let's call them, the surface level debates. What if banal subjects like the creation of the universe and evolution just aren't going deep enough? Shortly after the Torah was reduced to writing, we start to see the works of Plato circulating the ancient world in 360 BC. One of his fictional allegories, warning of the hubris of mankind, a dialogue between Timaeus and Critias, introduced the idea of a nation with a powerful navy, conquering lots of land around the world that was then known to the Greeks, a nation that was blessed by the gods, but ultimately they lost their divine protection and submerged into the ocean. Now, this idea had enough reference to spark the imagination of a lot of people throughout history. And essentially, ever since, people have been looking for the remains of this lost paradise of Atlantis. Despite the fact that even Plato's closest students believed this was just a fictional cautionary tale he was using as a lesson. Fast forward until the mid-1800s, and you start to see a movement called Theosophy taking hold on the fringes of the New Age Christianity of the 1800s. This Theosophy movement was founded by a mystic named Helena Blavatsky, and eventually she was disgraced for getting busted faking all her miracles and signs. But she believed the story of Atlantis was real, and that the Atlanteans were one of a few progenitor race ancestors of the modern humans. And she believed in the recently proposed gap theory that was introduced by Scottish theologian Thomas Chalmers in 1814, which says that after the first 24-hour day in Genesis 1, the one where God created the heavens and the earth, God took a gap year, or rather a gap undefined period of time, before really getting to creating the earth in Genesis 1, 2, and onward. And as soon as the idea of a gap was proposed, lots of, well, let's just call them creative thinkers, rushed in to fill that gap in. And Blavatsky thought one of the things that filled this gap in were the ascended masters. These former humans eventually evolved into spirit Super Saiyans, and they also gave Blavatsky secret info when she acted as their medium. These masters were a super best friends of religious figures, Jesus, Buddha, and Confucius, just to name a few. And despite it eventually coming to light that Blavatsky's shrine where her miracles took place was really a Scooby-Doo-esque setup of sliding doors, masks, hidden pipes to make sounds through, and fake lights, every few years or so, another religion pops up claiming access to these masters. Let's take, for example, much more recently, the Order of the Solar Temple, founded in the 1980s in Switzerland. A group that took up her ideas, sprinkled in some other elements such as secret society Christianity, a real thing called Rosicrucianism, which we're going to talk about another day, then begins dabbling and hiring out members of its order as political hitmen in Canada, until finally, on September 30th of 1994, the leadership of the order acted on a very final message from the masters. Now, the leaders of the cult did get caught pulling a Blavatsky and faking their own spiritual feats. They were under police investigation for their roles in training hitmen across Canada. And they were also having to deal with certain people of the cult getting a little bit older, growing up, marrying outside the family, or even worse, the kids starting to listen to pop music, which was an obvious sign of an infection of the Antichrist, and decided it was time. They needed to ascend to be with the masters. On the star, Sirius, obviously. Now, they created a series of letters called the Testament. They claimed it was definitely a divine message, and that they had 3 paths for their transit to Sirius: murder for the traitors, assisted suicide for the immortals, and suicide for the awakened. But this wouldn't count as real suicide in the biblical sense, since they were really just using it to skip their way through a long commute. This testament was mailed out, and by October 5th, the Swiss police were walking onto horrific scenes across the country. In one location, 23 people were found, drugged with sleeping pills, and shot or suffocated with plastic bags. A family of 5 set their own home on fire after drugging everyone inside, including the children. The rest were spread over 2 chalets where the inhabitants were drugged, suffocated, burned. Some of them recorded these scenes on VHS, tapes that show them drugging their children and having their last meals. In the end, 54 members of this group were slated to die, to match the 54 Templars burned at the stake in the 1300s. Only one member of the cult read this testament beforehand and booked it before the death squad could arrive. So the final body count was 53. 53 horrific, self-imposed murders traced directly back to not even the way someone read something in the Bible, but what they read between the lines, between sentence 1 and 2. And we're not even out of the first chapter. If nothing else, this highlights 2 lessons we have to take away as we continue this project. 1, if we truly want to understand the world, the frequently serious and potentially deadly beliefs surrounding us, a careful reading of Scripture and knowledge of how it is being used is of the utmost importance. It's why we do this podcast. And 2, we need to have a well thought out framework for what we read as we read it. And on that note, here's how I square what we just read with what makes my sense in my heart and soul. I'm okay with uncertainty about the exact creation of the universe, the timeline of that creation, the math and the physics behind it. But whether you call it a Big Bang or a cosmic egg or whatever, you can certainly square that with a state of being beginning in formlessness and void. To have light or energy streaming out, differentiated, separated from the darkness. A light that eventually surrounds a nascent earth that is still covered in an opaque layer of gases. The clouds and mists gradually parting to reveal planetary bodies and becoming distinct from the perspective of the rocky land of Earth, a Pangea shifting, land masses rearranging. Life beginning in the seas, followed by insects, land animals, and finally humans. That all fits just fine with the creation arc of the Bible, and the argument over whether each day was 24 hours, which is probably ridiculous, doesn't blow my skirt up enough to fight someone about. We were created in God's image, both male and female, and we have to honor that, not take entitlement from it. We have dominion over the earth. I think that's obvious. But we have to be caring custodians and not tyrants. You should pet and train your dogs, not beat them and cage them and exploit them. And ultimately, in the same sentiment of God, we have to look around and say, this is very good. Or, as the late great Kurt Vonnegut would say, we need to stop from time to time to gaze at all of this and exclaim, if this isn't nice, I don't know what is. And that's where I'll leave you for today, where we've just barely scratched the surface. Some of these things we will revisit as Genesis gives us room to breathe in some of the more redundant chapters, and some of it we just won't get to in the scope of this show. But I thank you for joining me on this journey. And until next time, keep the faith. Don't stop questioning.